Well, I've already talked quite a bit about how all important the concept of balance is in indigenous tribal cultures in North America. And now we're going to look at how that plays out in certain aspects of life, because that concept of balance applies to human life. In essence, because the balance must be maintained and because everything is categorized by tribal people, by kinship, and what tribe you are a member of, then if someone from another group kills a member of your group, balance requires that a member of their group be killed in return. Now, you would prefer it be the actual person who did the actual killing, but it doesn't have to be. It could be anyone, because there's a sense of community responsibility. Everything that you do as an individual reflects on your family and your clan and your village and your tribe. So you can see how that's going to be kind of confusing when they start interacting with European colonists, because the European approach is whoever did the killing is the person that has to pay, not just a random person on the other side. Now, this is true in warfare, but it's also true in not just intertribal but intra-tribal relations. If someone from the same tribe were to murder or even accidentally kill a member of their own tribe, then a member of the slain person's family or of their clan has the right to be the blood avenger. They have the right to hunt down the person who did the killing and take their life in return to restore the balance. And if they can't find that person, or if it's too inconvenient even to find that person, they could just take anyone from that person's family or that person's clan. Now, the idea of that sort of retribution to restore balance, that may sound familiar to you from Sunday school: an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And you may even be familiar in the Mosaic Law, in the Pentateuch, the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, where it talks about the blood avenger in the Bible. Now remember, the Israelites were a tribal people also. So ancient Israel, if you killed someone, even by accident, then a member of that person's family had the right to kill you. And in ancient Israel, there were certain places you could go for refuge. Not so with most native tribes. So you have the right to hunt them down or a member of their family. So this was taken so seriously by American Indians that there were several cases in the 1800s that were reported on by American press of southeastern Indians, Choctaws, Cherokees, and Creeks, and so forth, who perhaps in a drunken fight or perhaps in a fit of anger had killed someone from their own tribe, and so they were liable for execution in return for that lost life, or else a member of their family might suffer that. So almost always they would voluntarily show up. The blood avenger would not have to go looking for them. They would show up to submit to the restoration of the scales of balance. And there were even rituals among the Choctaw, for example, a very elaborate, detailed ritual in which, when you go in to offer yourself to the blood avenger in return for the human life that you have taken, your best friend goes with you and has a blanket, and they stand behind you, and when you are killed, they catch you in the blanket and gently lower you to the ground. there was a case in the late 1800s. By the late 1800s, this was illegal to follow these ancient customs, but many people still did. There was a case of a young Choctaw man who was a really good baseball player in the 1890s, I think, who was playing in the minor leagues and was on the verge of being called up to the major leagues, but he got in a fight and accidentally killed somebody, or maybe it wasn't accidental, maybe it was in the heat of the moment, and he could have just stayed away from his people and gone on with his baseball career, but he voluntarily came and turned himself over to be executed. There was another case of this was also a Choctaw who had joined the U.S. Army, and this was during the Spanish-American War, and he actually on leave had killed somebody in his own tribe, and he asked for permission. He asked for permission from his superior officers to go home to be killed. And they denied him permission because, by golly, it's your job to go get killed in Cuba. So he deserted the U.S. Army to go back home to face certain death. Now, sometimes it didn't work out that way. Sometimes you had, particularly by the 1800s, sometimes you had American Indians, sometimes who had white fathers and sort of had a foot in each world, who sort of were willing to think outside the box where tradition was concerned. And I actually came across a story about one such individual among the Cherokees who had gotten in a brawl. This was like in the 18-teens, I think. He had gotten in a brawl and killed somebody from another clan. So he was now liable for blood revenge. So he hid out, and he was hidden by some of his uncles. Cherokees are a matrilineal society, so the nephew-uncle relationship is stronger than the father-son relationship. So his uncles hid him out for a while. But then one day he ventured out with one of his uncles, and the members of the dead man's clan found out about it, and about a dozen of them surrounded them, and now they were going to exact their blood revenge. So the young guy who had done the killing, thinking very quickly, reaches over and grabs his uncle's pistol from his uncle's belt and shoots his own uncle and blows his brains out. At which point, the people in the other clan were very frustrated and angry because now they couldn't touch him, because now someone in his clan had died to pay the price, and he was able to go free. Now, that's not usually how it was done. This guy was he was using tradition, kind of like, a little bit of stretching the intent behind it. And I'm guessing that he probably, family reunions were probably kind of tense after that, and he probably had trouble finding traveling companions. Anyway, that's how it worked with murder, and it worked the same with war. So let's say that you are a Muskogee Creek person, and the Cherokees had come and raided your territory, and they had killed 4 of your people, and then they went back to their own territory. Well, to maintain your own people's honor and to restore balance to the universe, you were required as warriors to go kill 4 of them. Did not have to be the same 4. You just had to make sure you killed 4 to even the scale. But, you know how young men are. They get all kind of worked up. So maybe your group goes out and maybe they kill 7 Cherokees. Well, that means that the Cherokees are sort of morally bound to come back and kill 3 more of you. And so thus it would go back and forth with almost perpetual warfare, but usually with not a whole lot of fatalities. There would be some, I would imagine kind of equivalent to the number of people in an average town now who die in car wrecks each year. It happens. somebody it might happen to. So that would kind of go back and forth, and you're required to do that. The Cherokees, in fact, have this story. Now, remember when I said earlier that you have to maintain the balance when hunting, and you cannot take more than you need. You're also required, and this is true of the Cherokees, but it's true all the way up into the Algonquin-speaking tribes up into Canada, that when you do kill a creature for food, there are certain rituals you have to perform. Essentially, once you kill that creature, you have to go up to it and thank it for providing you with food and apologize for killing it and explain in your ritual, kind of had to do it, but thank you very much for your role. And then it's understood that one day you're going to die and the animals are going to eat you. It's just kind of a perpetual cycle. So you have to apologize when you kill an animal, except among the Cherokees, you don't have to apologize if you kill a bear, because bears don't deserve it. And that's because once upon a time, in the distant past, according to the stories, a bear had been killed. I think it was killed by wolves, if I remember correctly. And the other bears were like, man, that's a shame. But they didn't do anything. They didn't go off and kill a wolf. So they didn't play their role. They didn't do their part. And they allowed the universe to fall out of balance. And as a result, you don't need to apologize for killing any bear. Anyway, back to the Muskogee Creek and this whole situation where you've been raided, and so you've raided them back. Well, remember what I said about men being in charge of what happens outside the village, and usually being in charge of the taking of life. So, your raiding party, you take some Cherokees prisoner, you capture them, and it is your decision as warriors whether to just kill them right there where you have them, or bring them home to the village. And let's say you decide to bring them home. Once you get there, then it's out of your hands. Remember, we talked about this before, because the women make the decision about what happens to the captives usually. So what could happen? They could be, well, it depends on how the women are feeling that day. Maybe it depends on, how many of their people have been killed recently and what kind of mood it put them in. So they might decide these captives need to die, and it needs to be very painful. And they will actually help and take the lead in doing that. Or they might decide these captives fought bravely. We are short-handed because of all this fighting, so we're going to spare their lives and adopt them into our tribe. And that happened fairly often. But there was another option. The third option was kind of somewhere in between. You don't adopt them into the tribe, but rather you make them your servants. This is known as kinship slavery. The reason it's called that is because they are not entered into your family circle like they would be if they were adopted. And your family circle is your tribal circle, is your family circle. So they're not a member of the tribe, therefore they don't really have any rights. So when Europeans saw this, they interpreted it as slavery the way they viewed slavery. And it was similar, but not exactly the same. There were some differences. Now, I have here I think this is a DVD cover from a movie that you've probably never seen if you're one of my college students and you're not an untraditional student like I was, because this movie is from 50 years ago, 1970, starring Richard Harris, who many of you, if you know him at all, probably know him as Dumbledore, the first Dumbledore. This was in his younger days. The film is called A Man Called Horse. And the reason that I am featuring this here is because that movie does a pretty good job of portraying what kinship slavery looks like. So Richard Harris, who's English, actually I think he's Irish. He's a British actor. He plays this Englishman who is taken captive by Lakota Sioux I think it was set in the 1830s or 1840s. And they capture him, but they don't kill him. They bring him back to the village, and the elderly mother of one of the Lakota warriors who had been killed takes him, and he becomes her servant. And so they name him Horse because he becomes a beast of burden. You can see in the picture there, they force him to do all this work and carry stuff. The difference between that and chattel slavery, which was what was practiced on Africans and also practiced on Native Americans by Europeans, was that in chattel slavery or plantation slavery, the person who is enslaved is property. Well, if you've paid attention so far, you know it's not likely they'd be regarded by the Indians as property. They're in kind of this nebulous limbo-like state. Plantation slavery, chattel slavery, that's another word for that. You are a slave because of the color of your skin. In this case, it's not because of the color of your skin or because of who you are. It's because of who you are not. You're not a member of the tribe. Plantation slavery is hereditary. So if a female African slave has children, they're slaves too. This type of tribal slavery is not hereditary. If you have children, there's a good chance that someone in the tribe is going to adopt them, and they'll be full members of the tribe. Also, in plantation-style slavery, it's permanent, unless you are set free, which wasn't that common, really. It was much, much more common, however, for captives of Native American tribes who were forced into this type of experience. It usually wasn't permanent. If they proved themselves to be a valuable asset to the family and to the community, in time, they would be adopted into the tribe, and once that happened, they were full and equal members with everybody else. So it's a type of slavery. It's the type of slavery that was practiced by tribal groups in West Africa, actually, before the international slave trade sprang up. But it's not quite the same, and it has a lot to do with whether you're a member of the tribe or not. And remember, the women get to decide. Now, in this movie, not to give too much away, but the character, whose name is Lord John Morgan, I think, proves himself valuable and comes to appreciate the way of life of the Lakotas, and eventually he gets adopted into the tribe. Now, think about all the stuff that I've just told you about in this lecture and the previous one, about the role of men and women in deciding the fate of captives, and in the importance of having tribal membership. Now, one thing I'll point out, sometimes some tribes had kind of like semi-official temporary adoption ceremonies because they're really not able to bring themselves or to consider it in balance to deal with someone that is not in their kinship circle. And by deal with them, I mean by trade or diplomacy. So if you're going to participate in trade or diplomacy, you might marry your daughter off to one of the people from the other group, and then that will make a connection. Or you might even just temporarily adopt them through a ceremony. Okay, so bear all of that in mind, and I'm going to mention an incident that you're all familiar with, which actually comes not too much later in this narrative. When we get to it, we probably won't dwell on it much because we're going to dwell on it now. This incident involves Pocahontas and the Englishman, Captain John Smith. Not the sanitized Disney version, but the John Smith version. Actually, the way that this story has come down is because John Smith wrote about it. And I bet one way or another, whether it's through, when you were in kindergarten maybe, or whether it's through seeing the Disney movie or other movies, you have a basic idea of the story. The story is that the English had just started this settlement in Jamestown, in what would later become Virginia, and the local Native American chief, Powhatan or Powhatan, leader of the Powhatan Confederacy, some of his warriors captured Captain John Smith, dragged him to the village, and the chief's daughter, a beautiful maiden named Pocahontas, threw herself upon the captive and begged for his life, and her father spared him. And then they were able to negotiate and start some trade and so forth between the English and the Powhatans. A little bit of tension still here and there, particularly later, but that's how it turned out. The story is that Pocahontas was madly in love with John Smith. Now, if you know the history, you know that Pocahontas didn't marry John Smith. She married a different Englishman named John Rolfe. And you may have wondered, well, what's up with that? I thought she was madly in love with John Smith. She wasn't madly in love with John Smith. At this time, she was 9 years old, not a teenager. And there was more going on. The story we have, the story that you know, is John Smith's version. And John Smith was, he was really full of himself. If you look at his ship's logs from his travels before he ferried these English people across the Atlantic, he had traveled all around the world, and everywhere he went, according to him, beautiful savage princesses fell madly in love with him and threw themselves at him. Now, is that true? I think that it could have happened once, but for him it seemed to be a regular occurrence. I think that he was just sort of fond of the idea. There's another explanation for what happened, an explanation that the Europeans didn't pick up on because they didn't understand the native culture and never really bothered to. Who gets to decide what happens to a captive? The women, the females of the tribe. How do you go about establishing relations with someone who's not a member of your tribe? By having a ceremony in which they are adopted, if only temporarily. What do ceremonies involve? They involve rituals in which you act out some story. So, odds are this whole incident was planned out by Powhatan, and everyone involved except John Smith understood, okay, we're going to pretend like we're going to kill you. She's going to throw herself on you, beg for your life, and you're going to be spared. Then we're going to get down to business. So we don't know for sure that's how it happened, but it actually makes more sense than the John Smith version, and it is a really good example of how Europeans could totally misconstrue and misunderstand what was going on. And their descendants, which includes many of us, still do because of not having learned about native culture. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about Native American concepts of leadership. Also something that was vastly different from the European approach. Okay, well, let's talk about European leadership first. In the armies of England and France and Spain and all those European countries, how did you become an officer? Well, in later centuries, you would become an officer either by working your way up or by having a college degree or by going to officer training school. But in the 1600s and 1700s and into the 1800s, the way you became an officer was you bought your way into it. You bought a commission. You paid money and you were commissioned as an officer. Depending on how much money you paid, you could be a major or a colonel or a general. In other words, you didn't have to have the slightest idea how to do the job you were taking on. You didn't have to have any experience or any training. You had to have the money. Where did you get the money? Well, in European culture, during the late Middle Ages, there had been a developing of a bourgeois or the beginnings of a middle class. But people who had inherited wealth for generations, that money was tied up in land. And they had that land usually because it had been given to one of their ancestors by a king, sometimes for performing some service for that king. So the land that you own determines your status in European society, even in the military. And the way that the military would work in European armies was the officer, remember they're called commissioned officers. By the way, I'm not sure how many of you listening to me have any knowledge of how things work in the military. I know that some of you have a lot more knowledge about it than I do, because maybe you're here on the GI Bill. Maybe you have already served in the military. Others of you may not have. But what is a non-commissioned officer? Raise your hand if you know that, and I'll pretend like I can see you and that I'm calling on you right now. Yes, a non-commissioned officer is an enlisted man, not really an officer. It's sort of the top ranks that the regular enlisted person can achieve, like sergeant, different types of sergeant or corporal. Well, even if you're a top sergeant, you have to follow the orders of the lowliest lieutenant. And in 1700s, that person might not have any idea whatsoever what they were doing. Didn't matter. They tell you to go charge into those cannon. You do it, or you will be taken and whipped, or maybe even imprisoned or hanged for disobeying orders. None of those things are how it worked in American Indian culture. In American Indian culture, it was more of a meritocracy, and it was also more of a democracy than what was going on at the time, probably than what's going on still in the military in the European tradition. You would become a leader, a war leader, or even a chief, not because of heredity. Now, you hear people talking about, my grandmother was an Indian princess. There's no such thing except in a handful of tribes. Most of them actually in Arkansas, Louisiana region. 95% of Native American tribes do not have the tradition of hereditary leaders. And in many of them, if they did have hereditary leaders, it would be passed down to their nephew, not their son. So anyway, you don't become leader in 95% of cases because of what you own or who your parents were. You become leader because a majority of the warriors trust you to be the leader and elect you to be the leader. And they do that because of the things that you have done and the qualities that you have shown. That could be physical action, like courage in warfare, or being a really good scout, really good hunter. It could be spiritual or mental actions, like having a record of being wise and being sly, being clever, being wise, making good decisions. Or it could also be evidence of your spirituality, that you seem to have stronger medicine. And in the context of Native Americans, when we talk about medicine, it's like spiritual power. You seem to have stronger medicine than other people because of your relationship with the spirit world is a very serious one. So those were the kind of things that would get you leadership. Those were the kind of things that would get you trust, and trust would get you leadership. Even when you became a leader, though, you didn't really have power, because you couldn't just order anyone to do anything and then them have no choice but to do it. That's not how it worked. You have to be able to persuade people to follow your plan and do things the way that you recommend. And even the greatest Native American leaders, people like Tecumseh or Crazy Horse, who had solid records of being great tacticians and strategists, still had the occasional problem that they might have some people in their military force that are like, well, that sounds fine, but that's not how I want to do it, and they go off and do it their own way. This is one of the paradoxes of Native American society. It's very communal. Things are decided in context of what's best for the group, not the individual. But at the same time, it's remarkably individualistic, because no one has the right to tell anyone else, essentially, what to do. Now, this is very different, obviously, from the European approach. And this approach of, like the English general ordering his men to charge straight ahead into the cannon because he wants to distract the enemy by killing a bunch of his own men in order to do some other part of a plan. Most American Indians would look at that and think it was the stupidest thing they'd ever seen in their life. Why would you run straight into a cannon just because someone told you to? That's crazy. So a lot of times their goal was to win. And if they could win with minimal losses on their side, that's always better. Now, if you can't order people to do things, and you don't have the power to coerce them, then how do you get anything done? Well, a lot of Europeans who traveled among or lived among Native American tribes noticed how this would work. So I've got a couple of quotes from British traders, that's Trader, not traitor, British traders who lived at least for some time among the Cherokees in the 1700s. So here's one from Alexander Hewitt in 1779. He said, "When war is the result of their counsels and the great leader takes the field, anyone may refuse to follow him or may desert him without incurring any punishment. But by such ignominious conduct he loses reputation and forfeits the hopes of distinction and preferment." So you can't be ordered what to do, but if you don't do it and then things fall apart because you weren't there and didn't do your part, or there's a big victory but you weren't there because you were off doing your own thing, then you're missing out. Okay? James Adair, around the same time period, talked about how there was social control even though there wasn't direct power and coercion. He's talking about the Cherokees, and he said, quote, "They commend a warrior for having behaved valiantly against the enemy. When he acted cowardly, they introduced the minutest circumstances of the affair with severe sarcasms which wound deeply. I have known them to strike their delinquents with those sweetened darts so good-naturedly and skillfully that they would sooner die by torture than renew their shame by repeating the actions." So in other words, peer pressure. Peer pressure works especially good when you are in a group whose primary focus is the good of the group and of community and of being accepted by the community. So you don't have to do what the leader says. You can go off and do your own thing, but if you do, and then, either you're not involved in the victory or you contribute to the defeat, your friends, they're not gonna beat you or anything like that. They're gonna laugh at you. They're gonna make fun of you constantly and make you feel like crap. And the next time there's a battle and the leader says to you, you go that way, even if you don't necessarily want to go that way, you're going to stop and think about what's going to be waiting for you back at the village if you are not a team player. And if you've experienced this ridicule and sarcasm strongly enough, you would rather die than go back and face it again. So that's also a component of how many tribes, cultures involve the treatment of their children. Very, very rarely do you find a native culture where it is acceptable to beat your children or to physically harm your children in any way. They regarded white people as being barbarians for doing that. In fact, on one occasion, some Cherokees joined forces with the English to go fight the French, and on the way, they saw that the British general had a bunch of his own soldiers whipped for profanity. So they're beating their own people with whips because of something they said. That's just crazy. So those Cherokees quit and went home because they didn't want to hang out with such people. But their own people, they wouldn't treat that way, but they would make fun of them. And that's kind of how they would keep their kids in line, too. And if you have any experience, well, you all have experience being kids. Maybe some of you have experience being parents, but that can sting. That can sting really badly. All right, so let's stop now and kind of catch up with all the differences, the huge cultural differences between Native American Indians and European colonists who came over. And these are things that almost all native cultures did, right? So, no profit incentive. They are subsistence cultures. They just gather enough to survive, not enough to accumulate wealth, to hoard wealth up. The spiritual and the day-to-day are inseparable. You don't have certain things that are religious times and certain things that are secular. Everything is suffused with your religion. The very concepts of space and time differ. 3/4 of tribes are matrilineal, which is totally foreign to Europeans. Gendered divisions of labor, which Europeans could understand, although they divided it differently, but also influence. Women having in their sphere as much or more influence as men. The fact that leaders have a lot of influence, but they don't really have power to order anyone to do anything, and they gain their influence by their spirituality, but also by their generosity. The more that you give away, the more honor and esteem that you have, and also by their oratory skills, because you have to persuade people. So meetings among tribal elders, tribal councils could go on for a long time, because some of these individuals, they could rival the great orators of classical Rome in their ability to make an argument and convince people. Another thing about the subsistence culture, I got to tell this story. It takes place much later in time than the colonial period. It takes place in the 1880s. Sitting Bull, if you're familiar with him, the great Lakota Sioux leader, who was mostly a spiritual leader, who was one of the people in charge of the Battle of the Little Bighorn when they wiped out Custer's command. He later in life worked for Buffalo Bill's traveling Wild West show. Tourists just love to see those Indians and get their autographs. And he would be paid in $20 gold pieces. And as he was with this Wild West show, it's kind of like a circus, traveling around the country, and it actually went across the ocean and traveled around in Europe as well. I'm not sure that Sitting Bull went on that trip, but as he was traveling through the large cities in the American East, like Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Washington, he saw something he had never seen before in his life. He could not fathom it, that in these cities there were people who had enormous amounts of wealth. And at the same time, there were people in abject poverty, including children. There were children who didn't have a place to live and didn't have enough food to eat. And that blew Sitting Bull's mind, because in his culture, everyone is taken care of, and if times are good, they're good for everybody. If times are bad, they're bad for everybody. So what Sitting Bull would do, because he didn't really see any need for money, is when he would get paid with this sack of $20 gold pieces, he would go down to the poorest part of whatever city they were in, where the homeless children were gathered, and then he would just start throwing coins at them. Because his way of thinking about things and his values were radically different than those of, white American society. And this was, 200 or 300 years after the time period we're about to start discussing. So all these differences are going to lead, obviously, as I've continually hinted, to huge misunderstandings and serious problems.